Welcome to the third degree and welcome to Thinking About Doing a PhD webinar. My name is Craig and I'm here tonight with my three guests, Willie Smith, Yvonne Koo, and Judith Flora Wanda. I'll introduce them shortly. If I could just ask everybody for a little bit of housekeeping to start with. First, if you could please make sure your microphones are muted. That will make it easier for the presentations to be heard. Secondly, if there are any questions that you have, either general or specifically targeted to any of the four speakers tonight, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the text box. Or at the end, when we have a Q&A session, please do interject and ask your question to the individual involved. Tonight, it gives me great pleasure to talk about the PhD journey. And I'm with some people that I know very well that have all had very different experiences. Some of these people I've known over 25 years. It won't be too hard to guess who that is. Others I have met more recently, but each one brings to the table a unique journey, whether it be a personal journey of self-development or a professional journey through experience. This journey that we're trying to share with you, or that we hope to share with you tonight, looks at some of the things that we need to think about when we are considering undertaking a PhD. You might consider that we only want to talk about aspects of choosing your supervisor or writing a preliminary proposal, but that's not what we're trying to achieve. By sharing our personal journeys or aspects of our personal journeys as well, you might get some insights into the different, not barriers, but speed bumps that we might have encountered over the years through our own experience and how we've gone about solving that, as well as some of the more practical, who should be my supervisor? How do I write this? How do I choose a university? Which is kind of typical questions that we might have as well. Anyway, moving forward, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my three co-panelists. First of all, Dr. Yvonne Koo from Philip Morris International, Malaysia. Yvonne is the Manager of Scientific Engagement. Her PhD is in the pharmaceuticals and medical arena, but her engagement is actually with policy and other related areas as well. My second speaker is Associate Professor Willie Smith, formerly the head of School of Environment from Auckland University. It gives me great pleasure to have Willie here tonight because I first met Willie in my first year of university studies. Both he and I were new to Auckland University at the time, and we have gone from being lecturer-student to colleagues to friends, and over 25 years is pretty impressive. Third up is Judith Wanda. Judith is the Director of International Students at St. Augustine University, where she also lectures in public relations. Judith is also a former staff member of mine, having met and worked with her at the time she was doing her master's. Judith is in the absolute final throes of her PhD, and I think we're all looking forward to her settling that 100% next year. Then there's myself. I'm the principal of Third Degree. I'm also a former lecturer and educational manager. I've taught management, marketing, and economics at a number of universities, both in New Zealand and throughout Southeast Asia. And I've also been involved in supervision in Southeast Asia. So without further ado, let me hand over to Yvonne, who I understand is going to be sharing a very personal journey about her PhD and her experience undertaking her PhD. So over to you, Yvonne.
Sorry. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hi. Nice to see all of you. So I'm really glad to be part of this event. And so my name is Yvonne, as introduced by the organizer. So I'm really glad to share with all of you uh, my journey in my PhD studies. So let me start with how it all started. So to be honest, uh, I took on this PhD program because I wanted to escape from my routine work. Um, for me, routine can get quite boring at times. So when I started getting bored with my routine work at the Ministry of Health where I used to work, I started exploring what are the other ways that I could keep myself motivated and still be very passionate with what I do at work. So there were a couple of options. The first one was to do something by the side, which I had done at that point, which I did my master's degree at the University of Malaya by part-time, and I completed in somewhat a record time according to my supervisor. So then after my master's completion, then I asked myself, okay, now that I'm already like in this groove, like all geared up for to absorb more studies and to do more research, then what do I do? So well, the opportunity came about at that time that the Ministry of Health was offering scholarships for PhD studies. It could be local, it could be overseas. So I challenged myself. I, I challenged myself to first apply for an overseas scholarship, knowing that the competition would be high. And I also challenged myself, as in I wanted um, to go in a research area, which is still related to my work, but to get myself out of my comfort zone, let's put it this way. So I decided to apply for a university in the UK, and I went for Cambridge University. And I challenged myself further because in the application, I applied for a lab, a wet lab type of research. So just well, a year ago, I was doing my master's degree in applied research. So this time I wanted to go into wet lab. I want to get my hands dirty. So uh, the application process was not too bad, I think. Uh, I did the required things, I did the necessary things. I went through my interviews, and then I got accepted at the Department of Pharmacology. So I was put under the care of my supervisor, my PhD supervisor. So to me, that part was a bit nerve-wracking because I didn't know what to expect. Growing up in Malaysia, working in Malaysia, studying up to my second degree in Malaysia. Well, I struggled really. I struggled with some of the interviews because the accent part was very difficult for me to catch at that time, and it was through phone interviews. So that was nerve-wracking, but I was glad I got accepted. But when I started my PhD studies at the Department of Pharmacology, University of Cambridge, I realized that the most difficult part wasn't really the application and the acceptance process, but it was actually the initial assessment process in the first year. So because I was under the big umbrella of the School of Medicine and Biological Sciences. So we all had to subscribe to the standard format of assessment. So which meant in the first year, not only must I produce some initial results that show that my research was working. I also had to undergo like a mini viva with internal examiners, and I had to do a presentation to the whole department. So that part to me was really the toughest because the whole of first year, the first 12 months, I was living with the uncertainty whether or not I could continue with the rest of my PhD. You see, the risk was that I had some of my batchmates who were accepted into the PhD program, but at the end of the first year, at the end of the assessment, they were told that they were not suitable as to continue with their PhD. So some of them were converted into an MPhil instead. So that was really, to me, a huge challenge. And it was unfortunate that some of us didn't make it, but I was glad that I went through that process. Well, I survived. So I think it's all, for me, the challenge of being in a foreign institution, doing something new, and coming from I had 6, 7 years of working experience prior to embarking on my PhD journey. I had to reset my mind from a worker's mentality to a student's mentality, and the the biggest culture shock to me was that when I entered the department, when I entered my lab, the PhD students around me, some of them started a couple of years before me. They were really young, really, really young. Like in England, some of the bachelor's degree graduates, if you achieve a certain CGPA and above, you may continue with your PhD by skipping your master's studies. So I was in the company of kids. And that to me was really a huge culture shock, because not only had I had to reset my mentality from a worker's mentality to a student's mentality, but to a very young student's mentality, because I had to click with my lab mates. Yeah, but I mean, the culture is that people were very helpful. Fellow students were very helpful. My seniors in the lab were very helpful. My supervisor, of course, he was there whenever I needed him. And the technicians were especially helpful. So really, I think looking back, I survived because of the support system around me. Yeah, and to add to that, the university also has its college support system for me to adjust to my life in England. And the international office was also very helpful. Um, so for someone like me who had to transition from working life to student life to a PhD research student life, I think what's really important is that uh, you have to activate your humility. Uh, what I mean is that so when I entered the lab, and it was a wet lab, I had well, I I did lab during my undergraduate studies years, but it was many years behind. So I really had to remind myself to remain humble and to always seek for help and guidance from the seniors in the lab. And again, these are people who were much younger, than me. So humility is very important. You really, really must be ready to learn and to ask for help. I think that's very important. The second thing that I think is really important is also to remain focused on what is your end goal in obtaining this PhD. I mean, I've come across many people, especially those who graduated from their first degree or second degree and go right into PhD studies, that it's just another piece of qualification to their CV. But I don't think it's as simple as that, because you really must think of the end goal. Start with the end in mind. Let's put it this way. As in, what do you intend to do or to get out of this PhD journey? So for me, my aim was very clear. I needed to complete my PhD in time, because at certain point, my scholarship funding would run out. And what did I envision that my PhD degree will contribute to my work back at the Ministry of Health? So I was a drug evaluator. So I knew that I wanted to acquire new skills in drug development to help me assess the products that were coming into my agency as soon as I got back to work. So that's second piece of advice. But looking back, if I had not obtained a scholarship from the Ministry of Health, and I had obtained an independent scholarship to do my PhD, and that would meant that at the end of the PhD, I would be free to choose my career path. Then, and a piece of advice I would give myself is to spend less time at the lab and spend more time outside, because I think the part of networking is very, very important. If you intend to progress in a career in research, the friends that you make during your PhD studies will be your collaborators for life. Yeah, so I was spending too much time at the lab, to be honest, trying to do too much, which my supervisor kept reminding me that you can't have you can't complete all your experiments that you've planned. You have to prioritize, you have to do what's necessary, you have to manage your time well so that you balance your time inside and outside the lab as well. And at Cambridge University, there is a very large networking support available for those PhD students who intend to go into research and also commercialization activities post-PhD. So there are business competitions, business pitching, trainings. So you can really explore and get a feel of what life would be beyond your PhD. So if I could turn back time, I would really, really spend less time in the lab and go out and meet people.
Great, thank you for that, Yvonne. That was really good, and appreciate some of the honest experiences that you've had throughout your journey, and certainly, it's quite an achievement to be not only an international student, but to have gone to such a prestigious university, and to have not only not turned it into an academic career, but turning it into a professional industry-based career, but also in terms of how you can contribute to other people's lives as well. So thank you very much for that. Next up, I'm going to invite Willie to share, and I believe that he's going to talk a little bit more on some of the practical issues from his experience as a supervisor and how best to guide students. So Willie, over to you, my friend.
Very good. So, I think the biggest challenge in doing a PhD is getting something to do research on and finding a topic. And I think that can be really scary, because whether if we complain about what our supervisors or teachers ask us to do, to write an essay on this topic or that topic, it is much easier in many ways than thinking something up yourself. And you can waste an awful lot of time just trying to think on something or panicking about thinking on something. The biggest problem if you're asked to think on something yourself is usually that you think on something far, far too complicated. So if someone says, think on a question to write a 2,000-word essay on, you'll think on a topic that's going to take 5,000 words and 2 or 3 times the number of hours you should spend on it. So don't get over ambitious. Just ask simple questions. You can make them fancy with big words if you want to later, but it's probably not very helpful. So how do you find a topic? You're probably going to spend at least 3 years on this. So it's a good idea to find something interesting. And by interesting, it means something that you find interesting. So by this stage in your career in a university, you'll have decided you're interested in, let's say, agriculture, or you're interested in urban, or you're interested in slums, or you're interested in marketing. It depends on your discipline. and your own personal experience. So think, what would I like to spend my life doing? So my background has mainly been on farmers. Most of my research for decades has been on farming, mainly. And the reason was I thought in doing stuff in industry, and then I thought it would be extremely boring to speak to business people. People dressed in suits and ties, I thought would not be as interesting as people actually work on the farm. I was totally biased, of course, but that's how I got into the farming side. And then you think, well, what is it about farming that interests me? It might be marketing and farming. It might be land use. So then you think on that. And then you think, what do I know about land use? What doesn't make sense? What don't we understand? So you're trying to get to the point where you have a big question. Why do farmers make the decisions they do on how they use their land? You think, fine, I've got a question. So you then have a rest and a cup of tea or a beer. And then you come back to it a day or two later and you thought, what a stupid question I came up with. It's far too vague. So you start narrowing it down, making it shorter, making it crisper. And then you think, gee, this is hopeless. This is not going to work at all. So you throw it away and you do something else. It'd be a very rare person who can come up with the right question quickly. And you shouldn't panic about that. Most people will need to go and speak to their friends, speak to some other people who've already got a PhD, say, what do you think about this? Now, traditionally, the way to do it was from your reading. So if you're interested in urban planning, well, read some stuff on urban planning. There'll be stuff there that explains what's best one way, and there'll be another paper that contradicts them. So you might want to look at the contrast between them. Why can one person argue this and another person argue something different? So there's a gap there that you could fill. You may discover all the writing on farmers' decision making is mainly British or North American, and you're maybe living in Zambia, or you're living in Italy. And you say, well, farmers here don't behave like that. So you can take the ideas you get from overseas and then think, what's different here? And then you can say, well, how do we explain farmers' behavior in Tanzania? You can use the work from elsewhere and show that it's wrong, or show that it's partially wrong. And then you've got to explain why. So you move from one question about farmers' decision making, which might be your big question, to 3 or 4 little questions. You're trying to get questions, and your thesis is answering the question. So even when you come to writing the thesis, you've got to find chapter topics, chapter headings. Quite a good idea to have every chapter heading as a question. So if you've got, your supervisor will probably say, you better write a literature review. And you think, oh, a literature review. Well, that's not very exciting. But if you think, why am I writing this? You're writing it to see how the literature helps you, and therefore us, the readers, understand. So your chapter heading for the literature review might be, what does the literature tell us about farmers' decision making? So that tells you then what you're going to write about. You're not writing a review of all literature. You're writing a review about the literature on farmers' decision making, and you're trying to find out what does it tell us. So you may then say, right, 100 years ago they thought this, 50 years ago they thought this, but the world has changed. What's happening now? But if you think in terms of questions, it makes it much easier. So you start with the thesis of finding a question. The key thing is, again, is that it's something that will interest you and hold your attention for a while. The other, and to do that, speak to your friends, speak to other people, do some reading. You don't need to lock yourself in a little room till you've got the right questions. You will need help. Everybody needs help. When I go to do a piece of research now, after decades doing research, I will still check with friends, government officials, is this a good topic? And I will get a lot of help that will change my topic. That's just definitely vital. You should not be lonely doing a PhD, at least in finding a topic. Lean on other people, because you're building on who went before. You know, we use the phrase standing on the shoulders of earlier researchers, and it's very, very true. We're building on what they did. They weren't stupid, but the world has changed. The people we're looking at have changed, and therefore we need to modify the questions we're asking and modify our understanding. The other problem in getting a topic, you need to remember, is it must be doable. You may come up with a really fantastic topic. You think, and everyone says, that's wonderful. And then you go to do it and you discover there's absolutely no information on it. That's probably why no one has done it before you. A good PhD is one that is possible. So if you think this is fantastic and I'll need to visit 10 different countries in the world, well, waste of time if you've no money and if you haven't got the time to visit 10 countries. If you want to do something and all the data is secret in the government, it's kind of difficult to do. So you've got to balance what's interesting with what's practical. Now, a potential supervisor should be able to help with that. But when I was doing PhD, you're only supposed to have a vague idea. Oh, I want to do something in agriculture. I want to do something on transportation. I want to do something on business. And you then work with your supervisor on the topic. Now, an awful lot of universities are saying, please write a page on what you want to do. And so you do. I think that's very difficult. But you can always change it. And who you get to supervise you, then you would normally identify someone who's interested in the same area as you. One way of helping develop your own topic is to say, well, I want to work in University of Aberdeen. You'd look on the department site, depending on your discipline, see who's there and see who might be interested in what you're doing. And if they say, we're doing this, this, and this, that might give you some ideas of what you'd like to do. You might want to modify your topic quite a lot to fit in with your supervisor's interests. It's useful to have a supervisor who's really interested in your topic. A lot of supervisors are reluctant to take you if it's not something that interests them. So getting a match between you and the supervisor, and that sort of academic level, is kind of important. The other problem with it all is money. If you're living in New Zealand, as I am, and you want to do a PhD in New Zealand, there's a fair bit of money around just now. Therefore, and we're keen to get PhD students, but there'll be a lot of countries where there isn't much money around, and if you can take money with you, so we get quite a few students, say, from the Pacific coming to New Zealand, and they will usually get a scholarship beforehand or a New Zealand grant. If a student's coming with it, a grant is much easier to be accepted. So it's juggling several balls in your hands at once. But if you've got a good topic, you usually get funding and you usually get a supervisor. So it sounds complicated, and it's messy rather than complicated, and it certainly takes time. But working out a good topic is really important. And I see it as one big question that will eventually become the title of your thesis almost, but then 3 or 4 little questions. So if we go back to farmers' decision making, and that's going to be some kind of title for the thesis, your question might be, the little questions might be, how does land ownership influence decision making? So if you're a sharecropper, is your decision making very different from a landowner's? If you're a tenant farmer with a secure lease, so that might be an interesting thing to look at as part of your understanding. The other one might be government policy. Government might be pushing certain crops, and that would influence behavior. But you might have 3 or 4 questions that would become the basis of chapters, but also the basis of what you're going to have to find information on. So once you've got your questions, I think you want to think, well, where could I get information to answer that question? Am I going to have to do field work? Is that possible? Given the security situation in some countries, or your language skills, or whatever. It's useful sometimes to have some component of change in your thesis. By that I mean almost historical. If you're looking at change over 10 years or 30 years, you're going to find change. So you're going to get material. You need to look and where you'll get that information. But you can start a thesis, you can start it with really good questions and discover it's impossible, or discover it's really boring, even though you thought it was interesting to begin with. You can change your topic. There won't be too many people around who did a PhD, who got a nice topic to begin with and did what they said, what they thought. You will find new information as you go along. It's perfectly possible to modify your topic, so you're not setting something down in concrete. The other aspect of the topic is really, in a PhD, it gets into really what do we expect from a PhD. There's supposedly international standards, and whatever country you're in, you'll almost certainly be examined by someone in another country. You'll usually expect some contribution to theory, which again is kind of an intimidating idea, perhaps. But it's not really, it's just, theory is just a big idea. So if you're looking at peanut farming in Zambia, fine. And so you explain it all, and you say, well, the principle, people's decision making isn't that different anywhere in the world. Whether you're in Zambia, New Zealand, India, or Britain, farmers still want to make money. They want to be successful. They want to look after their land. They want to be able to feed their children. So you think, well, the principles of what you've found in your thesis, you can then generalize about them. Now, you may find a theory in the literature which you can test, and that would be a perfectly acceptable way to do things. But having a theory, having a theoretical component is important. That's probably where a supervisor is particularly useful. Now, I did my thesis without a theory to test, which wasn't really very clever. So I used what's called grounded theory, which is still around, which is I must create a theory, have my own theory, so I can say the contribution of my work, which was on Quebec, which is the French-speaking part of Canada, was to develop a theory to explain their behavior, and said, look, this theory you could use anywhere. So again, you're generalizing through your findings and through your theory, but the theoretical value of a thesis is important because you're at a level doing a PhD where you should be thinking beyond the local. You may be studying the local, that's great, but you should be able to say, what are the principles I found about farmers' behavior that I can generalize about? A supervisor should help a lot in that. Finding a supervisor is again, it's difficult. But when I'm saying all these things are difficult, I don't mean they're impossible. They're interesting challenges. if you've got you may get a supervisor because he's got lots of money and wants to employ you to do your thesis to help him with his research. That's great, fine. That would be a very good idea to do it. You may pick a supervisor because of his or her experience. He's published lots and lots on your favorite area, and that's a good basis to work with. She will be able to help you lots. That he, of course, ends up choosing you. You can choose him or her, but they'll choose you. And they say, well, don't want them, want that one, or whatever. So it's a two-way street. Depending on the country you're going to do a PhD into, you will increasingly find that you have 2 or 3 supervisors. You will have a committee. You would certainly get that in North America. You would be supervised by, let's say, 3 people, maybe more. And you might say, well, I'm a sociologist. They'll say, well, yes, we'll have 2 sociologists in the committee, but we think what you're doing has got a big economic component, so we're going to put an economist on, and we'll put on some expert in political science, which is useful, and you learn a lot. But you have to juggle 3 or 4 people. That's useful because you might not get on with your supervisor, and there's some days when you almost certainly won't get on with your supervisor because supervisors can have bad days, and you can change supervisors. A lot of students end up changing the supervisor, and supervisors are usually not too worried about that because they probably did the same. If you've got a good relationship, you've got a friend for life. If it's not working, there will be someone in the department you can go to get help and change it. Or when you're getting a supervisor, if you're in the same location, if you're both in the same room, then you can talk and decide, I wonder who else should be in the committee to help. It's getting someone who's interested in what you're doing is probably the main thing. I think the other thing to be careful about, someone who's clever, and probably that means from the point of view of a student, is someone who's published quite a lot, isn't necessarily a particularly good supervisor. They may be excellent, but they may be so busy advancing their own career, they don't have much time for you. So you want, when you selecting a supervisor, if possible, to find out, have they done this a lot before? A young supervisor who hasn't supervised many students may be great, absolutely great. And an older person may not be very good because they have no patience or whatever. And that usually happens. And even if you change supervisors part of the way through, your original supervisor will very rarely be outraged. Except because, as I say, they will have the same problems as you've had yourself. Why you may want more than one person supervising is partly that you get direct line to more than 2 people, and you get more experience in the supervision. But I think it's important that when you're a student or a candidate for PhD, there's nothing to stop you talking from people who are not in the department you're in. Certainly you can talk to people other than your supervisor. So if you've got a problem with would it be a good idea if I speak to someone in the statistics department? Or is there someone here you think I could talk to about this technique I'm planning to use? You can talk to anyone, and most people are flattered when you talk to them because you're going to them because they can help, and then people like helping. So you shouldn't do the PhD in isolation. You should take whatever help you can get. It may be from another discipline, it may be from another individual, maybe from fellow students. So I think that's a lot of problems occur because people become over dependent on the one supervisor, which is why you now get committees more commonly. Committees have an advantage too at times, very often actually. They fall out, and so the student usually wins, because one supervisor will say, this is required, and the other one will say, I disagree. Well, you win, because if they can't agree, why the hang should you be expected to change? So so we're not advising playing supervisors against one another, but it happens quite a lot, and it can work very positively. But getting that range of opinions is very, very important. And no matter how hard you've worked and how good your proposal is, you should get a lot more help once you meet your supervisor, because they will say, look, I like this, but I'd like a bit more on that. And that's great, because remember, they want you to succeed. And so you may disagree with what you've said, but talking it through with them is very important, because you want to have their backing all the way. Usually you have a right to expect their backing all the way too. It's really important. So I think we're saying now, getting close to saying what's a good thesis. One of the things I think is a bit unfair is we very rarely tell PhD candidate what we're going to be looking for in their thesis. So you send away the thesis in New Zealand, we might send it to Canberra or somewhere, or we might send it to New York, an academic there who's an expert in the field. And we'll say, we'd like you to examine this thesis. You'd never tell them what you're looking for, because it's supposed to be these common standards all over the world. So it's important to think what's being looked for. They're looking for something that should be interesting. Now, most PhDs aren't really very interesting. Something written in academic language over a period of 3 years loses a lot of interest, usually. But it should be interesting in the sense that the topic area should interest the examiner. And I think it's important, above all, to remember PhDs about communication. You might be the cleverest person in the world, but your job as a PhD is to show other people that you understand what you're doing, that you're thoughtful. And so the communication of what's in the paper is fundamental. Nearly all of us doing a PhD can't write very well. It doesn't matter what language you're writing your PhD in, or what language you were taught in. Most of us aren't very good at writing. And so writing a PhD is very often about editing a PhD. I think it's important not to give up hope before you start. Most of us can speak. But one way, you look at a blank sheet of paper and you think, I can't think what to say. And some people find a blank sheet of paper really scary. So I think there's tricks. One trick is thinking on the question you're going to answer. So each chapter becomes like an essay. What is the question I'm answering? The other thing is taping. Is not trying to write. It's putting on a tape recorder or some gadget that will record your voice and saying what you want to write. So once upon a time, there were many different farmers, whatever. Then playing it back to yourself and typing it out on your computer, what you were saying. You can often write the basis of a chapter very quickly that way, whereas you might still be sitting several hours later with a blank sheet of paper if you hadn't taped it. You will then have to edit it, because the written word is very different from the spoken word, but you've got a really good place to start. But you will have to edit. Now, supervisor will edit your work, probably, but that's a cultural thing. If you go to Germany, the supervisor won't be going to edit your work. They'll say, bring it to me once it's written, and in good German. The British, the Anglophone, approach is now quite a lot of editing usually, but getting it into a form that it is readable and understandable is very important. That would be one of the criteria. Lack of typographical errors, clear English if it's in English, and that just takes time. But you can do it. It's not that difficult. It's painful in the time it might take, but it is very important. It would be one of the criteria in the thesis. This thesis is well written, it's clear, it's logical, because the language is not just about the words and the sentences, but it is about the structure. Have you got a beginning, a middle, and an end? If you want to really simplify it, that's important. Does the student use diagrams effectively in tables? Tables and diagrams can save a lot of words. So if you're worried about all your spelling mistakes and your grammar errors, you can often explain something in a diagram, and then the text is really just describing what's in the diagram. You're looking for critical thought. You're looking for someone who reads the literature and says, but the literature is all focused on Britain. It doesn't fit my country or my field area. All the literature focuses on tiny samples, which is a problem, or all the literature is out of date. So the examiner wants to see evidence that you're thinking in that way, that you're seeing where the problems are. You're not just reading and accepting everything that's written. I think the other thing is that you will make mistakes doing a PhD. Everybody makes mistakes every day of the week, whether doing a PhD or not. And there is no shame in making mistakes. That's how we learn. I wouldn't trust anyone who said they just did everything and it worked. Like, totally ridiculous idea. So if you run into trouble with getting information, you can say, well, I was going to do this, but I hit a brick wall. I couldn't get the data. The sign of ability would then be to say, how did you get around that problem? But there's absolutely no flaw in admitting you had to change direction. And it's the fact that you overcame the problem. And it might mean that you had to drop a component of the work and pick up a new component. But acknowledging the limitations of what you've done. It doesn't mean apologizing for what you've done and saying, oh, I wasn't able to do this and this didn't work very well or that. It's explaining why you had a good idea, you hit a problem, and you got round the problem in some other way. A thesis that doesn't show some critical thought in that way it wouldn't fail, but it would be a limitation on the thesis. So a good grasp of the literature is usually pretty important. And synthesizing the literature. So probably by this stage you're doing a PhD, someone is giving you an assignment saying, write an essay on, using 10 articles, write an essay on climate change. And so you'd get 10 articles, and you may say, well, thinking has really changed over the 10 years. As paper 1 says, compared to paper 3, compared to paper 10. And that's really what you're being asked to do in your literature review. You're being asked to take all the literature, pull it all together. What are the common themes? What themes have emerged over time? What themes have disappeared? Or showing the limitations of the literature, or showing how literature in, let's say, Britain, focuses on very different things from, say, Australia, and explaining why. So the literature, you're not being asked to tell us purely and simply what literature says, but what the implications of literature and the limitations of literature have for your topic. So I think clarity, good organization, critical thought, synthesis, and evidence of a good grasp of quite a big bibliography or reference list. We'd normally be interested in whether the tables and diagrams were useful. It's exactly the same as you would get if you go, or maybe some of you already have published in the academic journals. They would be criteria. I've been in the review board of a big international journal for about 25 years, and we'd look for clarity, logic. Is it interesting? But we'd also look, are the tables and diagrams relevant? We'd often get far too many diagrams and tables that a writer has thought, stick this in, make it look as if I know a lot. And then maybe it may not be very interesting at all. So being rigorous in narrowing a short thesis is often much better than a long one. You want to focus on what you're actually trying to do. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Willie. Thanks for that. I appreciate all the advice that you've got in there. Unfortunately, we pre-recorded this, so I won't get to ask Willie more questions, but I've had a lot of conversations with him. So if you have a question in mind, I might be able to share a conversation that he and I have had over the past couple of months and share what his answers might have been. Next up, I'd like to welcome Judith Flora to talk and to share her experience. Judith was an international student in Malaysia, and now she is completing her PhD, the final year, back overseas, not within the Malaysian environment, but with the same supervisor from my understanding. Over to you, Judith.
Okay, thank you, Craig, for joining me in this Zoom presentation. My name's Judith Wanda. I'm a lecturer, assistant lecturer in St. Augustine University of Tanzania here in Tanzania. And I'm currently doing my PhD in journalism and mass communication in the University of Dar es Salaam here in Tanzania. As an international student, I've had a lot of challenges, especially when I started my PhD in Malaysia. The first challenge that I encountered was that as an international student, working and studying has not been easy because I had to find a balance between the two. But I'll be grateful to my supervisor who supervised me during my master's. I remember before starting my PhD, he actually asked me one question: why do you need a PhD? It was so difficult for me to answer that question because I was like, why would he ask me a question that, why do I have to do a PhD? And people are just, isn't it like just any other program, just like how someone is doing undergraduate or their master's? But when I started thinking through that question, I realized so many things. First, I realized it's not just about getting a PhD, but eventually who do I want to be, or what do I want to contribute in the field of education? Now that I had a lot of interest to now transit from the industry to go into academic world, I noticed PhD is not just to give me that title of being a doctor, but it is a platform for me to learn research skills. It's a platform for me to learn how to add new ideas, to add new skills, to learn different issues in terms of research, and to be able to contribute different things towards education. And now, when I started realizing those things, I noticed actually PhD, it's not about the title, because if I want a title, there are so many people who have titles. But at the end of the day, how much knowledge do they have when it comes into academic world? So basically, when I decided to now go to a register for my PhD, I really had a direction. After having that intense conversation with my former supervisor, I now could identify which area do I want to focus on. Currently, I'm focusing on acculturation of international students. And this came from my master's research. My master's research was on mobile phone use for social networking, whereby I was looking at students from East Africa. When they arrive in Malaysia, what is the first thing that they get? They actually get a mobile phone, and the whole essence is for them to be able to SMS or call their friends. So they're trying to use a mobile phone in order to be able to build a network and be able to maintain that relationship that they've had with people from their home country. So I noticed that from that aspect of using a mobile phone, the whole thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to get and to create a platform for them to acculturate in a new environment. Now, from that, it actually created an interest. It created an interest in me to be able to want to do my PhD, because I'm not doing it because I want to be Dr. Julie, but I'm doing it because I have found an interesting, I have this interesting area that I want to find out detailed information, like how do people acculturate, what are the factors that enable them to acculturate in a new environment, and why do they have to struggle with this thing called acculturation in order for them to achieve particular goals that they've set. And if you realize around the world, people are migrating from one country to another for many reasons. Some is because of marriage, some is because of education, some is because of work. So with all these reasons, in one way or another, they need to adapt into a new environment. And adapting into a new environment is this element that I'm studying, which is called acculturation. Now, so for me, I'm sharing this because if you don't have an interest in research that you're doing you will actually find your PhD as a struggle. And I've been reading a lot of platforms. People are complaining how they've been doing PhD for 10 years, how they've been doing PhD for 6 years. But for me, actually, the delay happens because I had to sit now that I was in Malaysia and I couldn't be able to be a full-time student because I'm a self-sponsored student. So I had to come back to Tanzania because I had gotten a job offer to teach as assistant lecturer. So I had to transfer back to Tanzania in order to continue my studies and work, because now managing it in Malaysia and not working was not going to be easy, especially on finances. So when I came back to Tanzania, I still carried on my topic, because acculturation happens anywhere. Even if you're moving from one city to another, you definitely are going to acculturate. So one thing is that this is an area that I have so much passion in it. It's an area that every day when I read any research about culture transition, when I read about adaptation, it's something that I find so exciting. So when you find that excitement in your research, doing a PhD is not a struggle. And it's going to be very easy when you have a plan. Like, for example, every time I read, I categorize my articles. If this article is about acculturation, I put them in one place, because I'm looking at acculturation and how the impact it has on interpersonal communication. So when I read anything about interpersonal communication, I also put it aside. When I read things about something about East African culture, I also put aside. So every time, like when I go back to my research, I know very well that I can go to this folder in order to be able to pick up any research I'm doing about that particular issue. So what I want to advise my fellow candidates is that don't just do your PhD for the sake of doing a PhD, but do it with an essence that you have an area of interest, and this area you want to add some knowledge to it, that one day when someone picks your research, they will be able to have something that they can reference from. And another thing is that you're doing this research because this is something that you're interested in, and you're learning, or rather you're developing skills that will help you to do more researches in future. Yeah, and I used to question and I wonder, how do people become professors? But I've noticed that once you have this interest of doing research, it's very easy. Like, you find yourself flowing through the process. Like, you won't even realize you've finished your proposal, you're now going to collect your data. Even data collection is going to be very easy, because nowadays we have so many tools that are available at our disposal. You can create a Google questionnaire and send the link to your friends, and they will answer the your questionnaire wherever they are around the world, and your data will be collected via email, and you'll be able to analyze. And from your research, you can actually develop papers. Like for my own research, I've actually developed 2 papers. The first one I've already submitted it, and now I'm writing the second one. And even something more interesting, I'm now even looking at how media plays a vital role in acculturation. Like stories that we read about people from different countries, immigrants, to what extent do they have an impact to these particular immigrants when they're in those countries? For example, when we had Corona breakdown, there are a lot of stories about Chinese transmitting COVID. And a good example is that there are some Chinese being beaten in Nairobi because people believed that seeing a Chinese is like having COVID in their country. But you see, as an academician, it will push you further to want to even do a research in this particular area and just find out, like, to what extent, what contributes to what. Yeah. So like for me, I'm looking at how media has played a vital role, or how it has contributed into acculturation of these immigrants in these particular countries where they are. So my encouragement is that PhD is actually not difficult. But what makes it difficult is when you start a PhD without a proper direction, or rather when you start a PhD without having an area of interest, and you're just like swimming through, a supervisor will tell you A and you follow, tell you B and you follow, and at the end of the day, you will be at the crossroad not knowing what you want. Like even when I came back with this topic from Malaysia to Tanzania, it has still been with me. No supervisor has told me, please drop this and do this. The only thing that they do is they help me to enhance areas. They help me to make it more better. They support me, and it has enabled me to grow because they realize that this is something that I love, and this is something that I don't just love because I love the word acculturation, but this is something that I've put much effort in it by reading. I actually have been reading a lot of journals about how people are acculturating from one culture to another. I mean, how people are acculturating in different cultures. For example, when you look at Hong Kong students, I've read a lot about Hong Kong students in Canada, in America, Korean students in America. I've read a lot about African students in US. So this culture transition has really helped me to understand the word acculturation and to be able to find different analyses, like to be able to find different concepts and factors that are contributing to this whole concept of acculturation. And therefore, this is something that I wouldn't want to do much research to it, as much as the more I keep doing more research. And I want to learn much in terms of data analysis, in terms of quantitative methodology, in terms of qualitative, in terms of triangulation. And, you know, as the technology keeps developing, there are a lot of data methodologies that are coming up. And this is something so interesting that at our PhD level, it helps. I mean, it makes you just want to keep doing more research and more research. So therefore, I would like to encourage those people who are looking forward to start their PhD to know that it's not a difficult journey, or rather it's not going to take you 10 years as how people are saying. It will never take you 6 years. The only thing you need to ask yourself is, why do I need a PhD? Am I doing it because I just need to be called a doctor, or am I doing it because there's an area of interest I want to develop further and learn more about it so that I can contribute ideas that will help future researchers, or that will help other people who are going to do research be able to adopt these ideas and develop much more in future. Like, for example, I'm looking at Berry's acculturation model, and this is a model that was developed in 1980. And there are so many people who have been referencing this model, but here I am in 2020 using this model to develop a new framework that someone somewhere one day will be able to adopt this framework, especially when I'm developing a framework of African students in Malaysia, something that has not been done before, because a lot of researchers have been developing frameworks for students who are coming from Hong Kong and Korea to US or Canada. So I'm looking at these people who are coming from Africa, going to Malaysia, where both these two countries share actually the same cultural background, because we are both collectivists. But you find that a lot of students, when they arrive in Malaysia, they find a struggle to acculturate. So yeah, I encourage all of you to go forward for your PhD. It's an easy journey. Take it and you will get it done in less than even 3 years. I'm finishing my second year of transferring, and I'm about to finish it. All the best.
Thanks for sharing with that, Judith. Your fourth speaker, and I do apologize for this in advance, is me. So no introductions needed. Let's get straight into it. My personal journey towards my PhD has been chaotic at best, I think. When I was completing my master's, I had in my mind, yes, I must continue with a PhD. In fact, I never wanted to leave the university environment. And at the time, my interests were a little bit different to what they became. I kind of flip-flopped a little bit. And I think that was one of the pieces of advice that I'm going to give is be very certain with what you want to do. Because in the early days when I was thinking about this, uh, those flip-flops not only cost me time, but they also in a way wasted a little bit of energy, which could have been used elsewhere. I first wanted to do a PhD in Asian studies. And because of my chosen topic, which actually is completely unrelated to anything I ended up by doing or I had done previously, I didn't have the certainty about how I wanted to approach it. I had talked to a professor at Auckland University who I knew well, Manning Ip, very well known Chinese studies scholar in New Zealand. Um, and she had suggested a few people that I could talk to in Australia, which I did. I flew across to Melbourne and had a couple of meetings. And yeah, those were the days you could just hop on a plane and fly somewhere for a meeting. Talked to a couple of people that were potential supervisors. Um, this was early days. I didn't have a proposal, but what I did was I had a topic that had piqued my interest, and I wanted to see whether it would pique their interests as well. So I held a couple of meetings, came back to New Zealand, was enthusiastic, but not really enthusiastic enough to proceed. So in the end, it got shelved for a while. And I think from memory, I shelved it for about 3 years until I moved out of the university system. I was teaching, um, and it was not uncommon for those with only a master's to be involved in teaching. But I had shelved the idea, decided that it was more important that I develop the career a little bit, and then moved back into teaching, moved back into research. When I finally quit University of Auckland as a staff member, I went into private sector education where I was lecturing and doing program management. And it came back that the PhD was a nice to have, not necessarily a necessity, but it was a nice to have. And from that, I started exploring possibilities. I looked at Massey University. In fact, I enrolled at Massey University under Professor Rolf Kramer, who was the Pro-Vice Chancellor at the time. Started to do work with him, but was looking for a second supervisor. He had a wonderful idea for a second supervisor, turned out to be somebody I didn't like and I didn't respect. And that became my entry level how to deal with your supervisor. Because at the end of the day, I was very fixated on whom I wanted to be involved and whom I didn't want to be involved. And I had to learn very quickly negotiation skills to circumvent some of those issues. I'd actually identified a supervisor that I wanted at Canterbury University, Leopold Dana, who was very well known at the time, I believe still is. And I flew down to Christchurch to talk to him about being my second supervisor. One of the very interesting things that I didn't really know then, but I certainly learnt as part of the journey, is it's much like an employment market. People will try to poach you. So I bowled up to Canterbury University, introduced myself to Leo, who I'd already set an appointment with. He subsequently introduced me to the head of department, and within the first 5 minutes, I was asked, why don't you transfer your PhD enrollment here? We'll take care of all your supervision requirements and whomever you want. And I started getting an offer. And I wasn't prepared for that. And in hindsight, I wish I had been, and I wish somebody had given me that particular advice, because at the end of the day, that shaped or changed how I wanted to proceed. And it also changed how I did proceed with my research. So that's sort of a little bit of the craziness that went on. But along that journey, what was very important, or what I got to learn just out of that particular set of experiences, is first up, think very carefully about who you want as your supervisor. It's perfectly fine to approach different people and to understand what their contributions can be, and what their level of interest in your research is going to be. But also it's very important for you as the researcher to be certain that you know what you want. I found that, or I believe I was too vague. I was quite happy to look at a deal versus an individual, which later didn't work out to be the deal I wanted anyway. But these are the things, these are the speed bumps, these are the personal things that I look at. When we choose our supervisor, we often look at either the university itself, what resources it can offer, what the department offers, the strength of the department, the networking opportunities available, or we might look at the supervisor in much the same way. But we also have to make sure that this is the person, especially our primary supervisor, this is the person that we're going to work with for the next 3 to 5 years, depending on how long it takes. So it's very important that we commit ourselves to that individual as well, because they're committing their time to us. Being too vague about it, or being willing to shift after you've made a decision, rather than exploring the options first and then making a concrete decision, I feel that was a big mistake on my behalf. What it also meant is my styles were changing a little bit, because I was trying to adjust to different individuals and how they wanted to work. So it was, a challenging time in that respect. The second key thing that I want to talk about is, as we start to do our PhD, no matter what level we're at, and I mean, in terms of where we're at today, how far down our journey we are, we've also got to think about how do we go about project managing our PhD? Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's not us reading and writing. That's a small element of it. But it's the entire management of the research process, thinking through the funding issues, whether we can get scholarships, whether we can get research grants or research funding. All of those type of opportunities come into the concept of project managing your dissertation and project managing your PhD. Now I'm going to do a workshop in, I think a few weeks, I can't remember exactly. I'm going to do a workshop that looks at project managing your PhD. And I think that will be an interesting one to think through. One of the things that I also learned is, don't worry so much about your quality of writing. I was very paranoid about the fact that I wasn't a particularly strong writer back in that particular time. I remember talking to different people. One of the very first people I talked to about doing a PhD was Henry Jung from National University of Singapore. And his very first things that he said to me was, you need to publish 4 times a year, whether it be conferences, whether it be journal articles, but you must do 4 times a year. And I felt this incredible intensity of pressure on doing that. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't think I can cope with that. That seems a lot. Partly because I never had, at the time, that confidence in my own writing. But what I learned over time, and this is something that I really want to impart to all of you, is writing improves over time. And that's why we have people that help us with editing. That's why hindsight and just re-looking at our own writing, even a few weeks after we've done it, helps us to strengthen and become better and better and better. When I look at my early writing today, I share it with my staff sometimes so that, you know, I can show, you can see how bad I was at writing. But you don't have to be perfect. What you have to do is improve at every stage. So as you go through the logging on, we'll call it, to the PhD experience, your writing's going to get better. You might take some classes, you might get some feedback, you might get some feedback you hate, but it will help to develop and strengthen you as a writer. The other thing that I wanted to share, and I think I'm in a bit of an unusual position here, because when I look at my co-panelists today, Judith is going to be a career academic. She's already well onto that path. Yvonne had a mid-career change where she decided that moving up a level in terms of qualifications was going to not only provide different access to her for different purposes, but it was going to help her career. Willie is an absolute career academic as far as I can remember, and from all the stories that he has shared with me. You know, it was straight from the beginning of university through to a PhD, through to lecturing, and then up the ladder that one does in faculty. My journey was a little bit different. I always perceived that I'd be a career academic, but I've spent the last 10 years running a private sector organization. And now as I go back into the academic world, I still do it as a teacher, not so much as a researcher. So an important thing to ask yourself, are you doing, or why are you doing your PhD? Are you doing your PhD because you want to get into academia? Are you doing your PhD because you want to advance career opportunities? Or are you doing it for some other reason? The rationale behind that doesn't matter what it is, it's personal to you. But understanding what the rationale is going to be is also going to help you shape the opportunities that you're going to get. So when Henry talked to me about you must do 4 publications a year, you know, that's going to shape my academic career in the fact that I'm getting onto not only the publication track, but nowadays, in order to get into tenure track for a lot of universities, you need to showcase publications before your PhD is even finished. You know, I've got 6 publications and I'm about to defend my dissertation, is seen as better than I've defended my dissertation and now I'm doing some publications. So it helps you with your planning. It helps you with your strategic goals into where you are going to go with your research and where you're going to take it. Now, I've purposely chosen not to talk about some of the basic things that have been discussed a little bit. You know, things like what are the important considerations with a supervisor, or how do I go about writing? I wanted to share the personal journey because the PhD is a personal journey to each one of us. And what we've got to look at is different factors that impact us and our lives, and making sure that we make the right decisions for ourselves during that process. So hopefully out of my journey, you've probably picked up a couple of unique points to think about. I'm going to finish with one final point that's most important. Get to know your supervisor outside of their office before you engage. That means before you finalize the situation to do research with that university, that department, that individual, spend a little bit of time to understand what their expectations are and what their style of working is going to be. Because they're like a work supervisor for you. At the end of the day, you will be significantly influenced by their work habits, and that's going to rub off on not only your research, but how you deal with your future mentees and research students, should you end up by supervising. but it will actually influence the overall scheme of things. So I do believe it's very important to spend some time to understand how they work, how they think, and make sure that that aligns well with you. Because if the alignment isn't there, you're actually in for a very tough journey. And the PhD isn't easy to start with. You know, it's not the most impossible thing on earth, but it's not easy. And if the relationship with your supervisor is not a strong one or not a friendly one, then that is going to pose some challenges for you. And it's not to say you have to be friends with them, because you don't, but you do have to be comfortable with spending time with them and taking their feedback without taking it personally. So that's my experience. I'm more open to questions, and I think the best part of a webinar like this, where we've got panelists, is the opportunity for you guys to ask any question that you have, and we'll do our best to either answer it from shared experiences or from the way in which we think about undertaking research and supervising research. So Kate, I'm going to hand it over to you now for questions and answers. And these questions can be directed to either myself, to Judith, or to Yvonne. Thank you.